Alright, so 6 months with the Sony a7S III. Let's talk about it. Now, I've been waiting a bit to share my thoughts on this camera before I did essentially a full review of it, just to make sure I had enough time with it to dig into it on a number of gigs. And while I've covered a decent amount of different topics with the camera on my channel, I figured it was kind of overdue at this point to give it a full review and just share my thoughts on it. Now, I'll probably break this down into a few different sections, covering some of the areas of the camera that I think are excellent and really the kind of main reasons I purchased this camera in the first place, the good features which may not be consequential overall in purchasing it, but I think are nice and appreciated, and maybe the not so good as well, because no camera's perfect, and so we need to cover that aspect as well. But I think if you're curious for a general summary before I dive into things, this camera is essentially the largest expenditure I've made in videography, but it's also probably the best investment I've made up to this point. So let's talk about it. Now, one of the more notable features of the a7S III is its ability to shoot 4K resolution up to 120 frames per second, as well as HD resolution in 1080p up to 240 frames per second. Now, other than streaming, I really haven't done much with regard to HD resolution, and I've certainly messed around with the 4K 120, but I honestly think one of the most notable features of this camera is its 60 frames per second in 4K mode. Really what you're getting on that front is what I would say is still a rarity, and maybe the best version of this on the mirrorless camera front. And really that is high quality 4K 60 frames per second in a range of different codecs, from long op to all intra, no recording time limits whatsoever, no concerns of overheating whatsoever, no crop to get that, and really just an overall uncompromised image in that regard. This is obviously popular in terms of, say, certain wedding shooters who like to shoot in 60 frames per second, or just those that like to do general kind of good quality slow motion. Now, previously in the past, this was always a debate of, do you shoot in 1080p at 60 frames per second and hope to upscale that to where it's not noticeable, or do 4K 24 and maybe instead rely on optical flow analysis to get kind of a slow motion look. Now you can really shoot high quality true 4K slow motion, do so in camera, get audio with it, and really not suffer any disadvantages with that. And I would say that's really changed the way that I approach shooting a bunch of different gigs overall. Now, because I mentioned it, let's talk about overheating very briefly. So this camera does feature a new thermal core that is supposed to help with overheating, and I will say that in the various times I've used it, it has not overheated on me one single time. Now, of course, I have set the temperature threshold to high in the camera, which is something I think a lot of Sony shooters end up doing for the most part, and hasn't seemed to really cause any issues long-term with these cameras. I will also say, too, that my a7 III has never had any overheating issues in the multiple times I've used it. And with regard to the a7S III, I've taken this thing out now and shot for hours upon hours outside in 80, 90, close to, frankly, 100-degree temperatures for things like weddings, and I have not even received a warning on screen in terms of temperature issues. So confidence-wise, overheating is not an issue with this camera that I would be particularly concerned about, at least as far as the climate in the New Jersey, Philadelphia area is concerned. Now, to circle back on the codec front, it is also worth noting that Sony has included a range of new types of codecs with this camera and some of their newer generation bodies like the A1. So this includes now an H.265 option, which is XAVC-HS. This includes an all-intra option, which is XAVC-SI, and the good old XAVC-S, which is generally what I've been using at this point since it's a good balance between size and quality overall. Overall, I think it's nice that Sony kind of gives you this option, whereas some brands might affix a certain level of bitrate or resolution to a given codec. Now, if I had something like an M1 Mac, I might be reliant on XAVC-HS and an H.265 recording format for most cases. In this case, XAVC-S actually does perform very well, even without making any proxies for it. That said, if you're doing anything with multiple cameras, multiple clips and layers of them, or multicam, you're going to generally want to do proxies anyway, which, yes, you can do and create in the camera itself, or make in post without too much issue. And I talked about this in my video on SD cards for Sony mirrorless cameras, which I'd recommend checking out, but it's really nice to see that the record times I get for 4K 24 frames per second in 10-bit 422 on this camera are essentially exactly aligned with what I get doing 4K 24 frames a second, 8-bit 420 in my Sony a7 III. Now, to summarize that video to an extent, I've been using ProGrade's V90 cards in the 256 gig variant since I've gotten this camera, and they've worked out excellently. And of course, related to that, this camera does include dual card slots, which support both UHS-2 SD cards and CF Express Type A. CF Express Type A is a great option if you want to do that and if you want to pay into that system and get a separate reader for it. But yes, you can use just high-quality UHS-2 SD cards. They'll be cross-compatible with a lot of your other cameras as well if they still only take, say, UHS-1, and or UHS-2 slots, and so I think this is actually a really good option for a lot of A7S III owners. Now, something I haven't even tapped to at this point is, of course, the fact that this camera can also record up to 16-bit, but maybe more so 12-bit practically, RAW, in terms of ProRes RAW, through the HDMI out into an external recorder, say like the Atomos Ninja. Now, I don't have much use for RAW in my current workflow with the type of gigs I do, but the fact that Sony has made this available and essentially unlocked this for now their mirrorless bodies at this level, I think is a really powerful feature as well, and definitely speaks to, again, what you're getting in terms of the value for this camera. Now, with regard to the autofocus on this camera, Sony autofocus has been excellent for a number of years. It's right up there, certainly with Canon, probably debatable as to who's better at any given point in time, and frankly, it just gets better and better with time. The A7S III is no exception to this. Going back to even cameras like my A6500, I was never disappointed with Sony autofocus, and that still remains true. Now, arguably maybe the biggest advancement with this generation of Sony body is the touch tracking feature. This is a really powerful feature that lets you track pretty much anything and everything that is moving and or is still, whether that's a person or an object or what have you, and do so really reliably. I generally used to keep most of my Sony cameras in spot focus mode when I was doing different types of operations, but I now tend to keep it in touch tracking mode a lot of the time. Now, Sony also increased the level of granularity that you can set the autofocus responsiveness and subject shift sensitivity, some related settings in the camera. I'll say that I'm someone that generally does more middle of the road settings, but I have gotten a chance to test some of the higher levels of this out and just the general autofocus at its top end settings, say with a recent kids basketball game that I had an opportunity to shoot. Overall, the autofocus on this is just ridiculously impressive. Pretty much you can point this camera in a given direction at what you want to focus on. More often than not, it will generally do as you expect. And this is true at even more shallow depth of fields and other kinds of focal lengths that might be more challenging for autofocus. As someone that generally likes to keep things locked off and in manual focus, say if you have like a static shot at a wedding, this is a camera that I would generally actually trust to keep in autofocus for something like this. And that's perhaps saying a lot. One thing also worth noting is that this camera has excellent, or essentially very little to no, rolling shutter in terms of how it performs in that regard. This is actually going to make certain things, like if you're doing handheld motion and types of movements, really smooth, and is not going to give you that kind of jello feel that a lot of Sony's other cameras have had over the years. I would say the A7 III certainly exhibits this, and the A6500 I once had a lot of this. Now, in terms of talking about maybe doing handheld action and movements, Sony has really improved the in-body image stabilization, or IBIS, in this camera and in many of their new cameras going forward, again, like the A1. Really, the biggest advancement here is the active steady shot system, which provides, I believe, 5.5 stops of image stabilization in camera. Now, this gives you a 1.1 times crop on whatever you're shooting, which I would say isn't too noticeable in terms of if you framed up a shot already, but more importantly, it's going to really allow you to get some pretty steady shots. Maybe if not trying to walk or run with the camera, but certainly trying to just get solid handheld movements. If you've ever been concerned trying to go handheld with one of these cameras, as I was with a lot of Sony's models in the past, this is definitely one you can start to confidently shoot handheld with. Now let's talk about picture profiles and color science. This is arguably one of the more contentious topics with Sony cameras and their users, but I would say this gets a lot less contentious with this camera and a lot of Sony's models going forward. Pretty much the A7S III is, I think, one of the first cameras that kind of has ushered Sony into a new era of color science, and this is maybe for a few reasons. Number one, because you can shoot 10-bit 422 now, you can shoot S-Log, say S-Log 3 with sgamut3.cine, confidently and be able to grade it appropriately and get you the maximum dynamic range that the camera provides. Now, also equally important to someone like me that does a lot of run and gun gigs, you have S-Cinetone in this camera as well, which looks pretty much ready to go out of camera. Now, I did do a separate video on S-Cinetone that you can check out, and I did tweak the picture profile slightly on this to accommodate my taste, but this has been a huge change in terms of just quality color and me delivering footage right out of camera to different clients and not having to worry too much about grading, at least for certain projects and things that I deliver. And overall, I think Sony has kind of fixed some of the heavier green skews that used to be ever present in a lot of their older cameras. So there's not too much to complain about there. And since I mentioned it, let's also touch back on that. 10-bit 422. This is a big thing just to have in general, but especially for Sony to finally start doing in their premium mirrorless cameras. Really, 10-bit 422 is going to be something you will come to appreciate when you get in those scenarios when you need to push and pull your image to a certain extent perhaps more than you even thought you would, say to recover highlights, or to change a grade on an image fairly significantly from how you originally shot it. This is a largely welcome change, and something really nice to see. This is also one of the things that makes shooting an S-Log that much more doable in this camera, without having to worry too much about the image falling apart or noise performance. And yes, let's also touch back on that topic for a second as well. So yes, this camera includes a 12 megapixel sensor that is primarily oriented around video use, as is this entire camera really, but is also designed to essentially provide great low light performance as well, and allowing an ISO range that goes somewhere up into the 400,000 number, I believe. Now, I did a separate video on the essentially dual base ISOs that the A7S III and FX3 has, and this is definitely something I'd recommend checking out. The bottom line is, in certain low light situations, you will have a second ISO value that you can kind of target hitting in terms of your exposure that's going to still give you an image that is nearly as clean as what you'd have at its original base ISO per given picture profile. And again, this is something that's going to really allow you to shoot in a lot of dark or otherwise not so great lighting situations while having the ability to know that you will still get the shot and be able to get it pretty cleanly. Now, to maybe kind of round this selection of excellent points that I love about this camera up, the flip screen. Yes, the flip screen. It's a big deal. It is immensely helpful if I'm recording a talking head like this. It also makes essentially shooting at different angles, say very high up or very low to the ground, a bit easier as well because you have a lot more room to adjust that screen, say than when it was just a tilt model. I really hope that at least for those hybrid and video focus models, Sony sticks with the flip screen. It's a nice thing to have. Another thing worth noting too is the viewfinder on this camera is excellent. It's a 9.4 million dot display that pretty much looks about as close to real life as you're going to get in a mirrorless camera viewfinder. Certainly much better than what I've seen in the A7 III and leagues above what I had in the A6500. So that I think rounds up what I think is excellent about this camera. And that was a lot. So what's good, I would say at this point? What are some of these features that I appreciate? They're nice to have, but they're not necessarily consequential and the difference maker in me purchasing this camera and explain why I own it today. So the new menus. This is really good. It's an improvement, certainly compared to what Sony had in the past on their other cameras. It is also now touchscreen based, so you can certainly navigate the menus a bit easier if you're someone that likes to do that. In my case, I still end up using the tactile buttons, probably out of force of habit at this point. Would the older menu system on this camera rule it out for me? No, but it's definitely something that's nice to have, and I think and hope that with most of Sony's newer cameras that are based on the Bionz XR processor, like the A7S III, that it continues to include these. Alright, another good thing, which is battery life. It is very good still. This camera, like a lot of Sony's other premium mirrorless bodies, uses the NP-FZ100 batteries, and I would say I get easily around an hour and a half of recording time or so, give or take maybe 10 to 20 minutes depending on what frame rate I'm shooting in, usually shooting in 4K resolution. Now, I would say I get a little more battery life out of my A7 III still and can generally shoot with that maybe closer to around 2 hours or so, just approximately. That said, I'm also shooting in higher frame rates in this camera and a higher bit depth and chroma subsampling, so I think a lot of this balances out, and overall battery life is pretty solid. Another good thing with this camera body, I would say, is ergonomics at this point. Sony has extended the grip a bit with this camera body, and it makes a notable difference when you're holding it handheld. Again, a nice notable improvement that you'll definitely feel the first time you pick this up if you're someone that owns another Sony body. Now, the other really good thing about this camera beyond just pure ergonomics is the way they've improved the body in a lot of kind of minute but still important ways, whether that's actually moving the record button to the top to make it a little more prominent and easier to use, say if you're shooting it in sort of a talking head vlog style fashion, whether that's the port doors on the side and making them a little more rigid in terms of how they lock and close and not just kind of dangle also like the other ones on, say, some of Sony's other models when they were open, the full-size HDMI connection, which is totally appreciated as someone like me that occasionally does live streaming gigs and or likes to capture the output of my screen for different purposes, and the strap hooks, which can also stay in place now and don't dangle around like on a lot of Sony's other models in the past. All good improvements, no complaints here. Not huge differences for me, but definitely nice to see. So that encompasses the good overall of this camera. So what would cover, say, the not so good aspects of the A7S III? So yes, because this camera, as I mentioned, has a 12 megapixel sensor, you cannot do Sony's APS-C crop mode in 4K on this camera. Now you can still do it in 1080p resolution, and there are, of course, other workarounds like clear image zoom that you can utilize in 4K. Now, is this something that's been really consequential in not having when I'm shooting different things? No. Is it something that I've missed on occasion when I wanted to get a little extra reach out of my given lens? Yeah, I wondered actually before purchasing this if this would be something that would kind of bother me more over time. It really hasn't, and in a lot of cases you'll probably acclimate just fine in getting used to not having it shooting in 4K, while also maybe keeping in mind if you shoot with other cameras like the A7 III that I also have, which still do have it, what to use when and in what situation if you know you might or will need a little extra reach out of your lenses. I'll definitely be looking forward to this mode coming back in sort of further Sony models, but yeah, would be nice to have. All right, the second not so good thing, we might say just sort of a maybe slight lacking in terms of actual video-focused features that this camera has. Now, I've seen people point this out more so with the FX3, which I'll talk about in a second, but I would say this is also true of the A7S III since they're effectively internally the same camera. So there is no ability to gauge your exposure, say through false color or waveforms like you have in a lot of other different cinema cameras. You don't have a true shutter angle, right? You're still using effectively shutter speed as you would with many photo-based cameras. It doesn't have what's known as true 24p, i.e. actually 24 frames per second rather than 23.98. You don't have any ability to load like custom LUTs in here and monitor that if you're shooting in log. Pretty much you have to just use Gamma Display Assist, and that's going to be the closest you'll get. And you can't turn off the internal noise reduction, which at certain higher ISO levels, you'd actually probably benefit and have maybe a cleaner image if you were able to turn that off. Now again, if Sony's going to hamper this camera in some ways by not having it quite match up to cameras like the FX6 and FX9, I think it's a pretty acceptable way to do it compared to maybe how some other manufacturers have limited their cameras in different ways. Not going to mention any names. But it's fair to say some of these features would be nice to have, and if Sony could start maybe rolling out or introducing some of these in their subsequent bodies, at least their more video-focused ones, it'd be a nice thing to see. And maybe the last not-so-great thing, there are some little quirks with the body of this camera that I've noticed and some others have talked about up to this point. Yes, the dual SD and CF Express Type A card slot door is a little sticky, though it does wear in over time and get better. The flip screen is arguably a little bit flimsy, but I think this is kind of a function of most flip screens in cameras like this. And yeah, the battery door doesn't feel quite as firm as it does, say, on cameras like my A7 III, but I think at this point we're sort of splitting hairs. Overall, the not so good in this camera is pretty minimal. The good of this camera is solid. There's a decent list of features, but really, as you can see, the excellent points of this kind of outweigh nearly everything else. Now, because I mentioned the FX3, it's worth talking about that in the context of the A7S III and deciding maybe between which of these you would want to purchase if you're looking at this camera. Because again, they are effectively the same. I would say this is really sort of an apples to apples comparison rather than, say, apples to oranges. Really, the FX3 is going to give you some more options in terms of capturing audio, say via XLR, and the included, essentially kind of modularized K3M module that they've put with the top handle on the FX3. You're going to have additional mounting points as well compared to the typical Sony A7, A9, A1 style body that they have on the A7S III. Though in many cases, I think people will still end up getting a half or full cage for their camera if they do intend to build out their rig a bit. And yes, you do gain some slightly different button mapping with the FX3 and placement of things compared to the A7S III, along with not having a viewfinder, which you have on the A7S III. Now, I think ultimately you'll have to sort of make the judgment call as to whether that $400 price difference and sort of the slight difference in features are worth it for you for the FX3 versus the maybe size and form factor for the A7S III. Now, I purchased this after the FX3 was announced, and I just tend to prefer sort of the Sony mirrorless camera body fashion. Having the viewfinder is a nice convenience for me, and I'm fine with being able to capture audio through a 3.5mm shotgun mic on camera, and when I need to do something a bit more professional, monitor it, I have an external recorder that can do XLR. Ultimately, though, as I said, this is really sort of an apples to apples comparison. It's just a matter of whether you want, say, maybe red apples or green apples. And so since we're now at the end of covering at least most everything I can think of with the A7S III, what is sort of the final summary of all of my thoughts? As I said, though it's been the largest investment I've made in videography up to this point, it's probably been the best one I've made. This camera has changed in a lot of ways for the better, the way I approach shooting a number of different types of events, and just how I shoot video in these mirrorless cameras to begin with. Whether that's being able to now get 4K 60 and 4K 120 to have great high quality slow motion footage, having better options and better looking in-body color when I want it, having the ability to do better custom grading and to shoot in log when I need that as well, have the ability to push and pull colors in 10-bit 422 so I can recover situations where exposure wasn't as ideal as I wanted it to be in camera. Having the ability to confidently shoot handheld a lot more often now with a better IBIS system as well that facilitates this. Having the ability to shoot in a range of different codecs depending on what my storage requirements or my post workflow is going to be. Having better ergonomic and body kind of related conveniences as well in terms of just the general usability of the camera. And on and on. As someone that shoots a lot of different types of things and still does a lot of second shooting, a lot of run and gun work, and this is for a variety of different events. So just to talk through some of the different scenarios I've shot with this in, we have weddings, engagements, baptisms, small commercials and things like that for social media use. We have modeling and portrait shoots, concerts, different sorts of corporate video work as well. And again, that list goes on. If you're someone that is serious about video shooting and wanting to do so in the mirrorless kind of camera form factor, at the time of making this video, I think this is one of, or arguably the best camera bodies out there and systems in terms of the Sony system that really does this. And so those are my thoughts on the a7S III. And yeah, that's probably a long video. Now, hopefully this video has been of some help to you. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if it has. I'm definitely going to be covering more around the Sony a7S III as time goes on with this channel, as well as just general Sony mirrorless camera tips, tricks, and recommendations as I've been doing up to this point. That is all I have to say. So thanks for watching.